There comes a moment in a Sigma's evolution when something inside him clicks. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that changes everything. It's the moment he realizes he no longer needs to be understood by anyone. Not friends, not partners, not society. The pressure to explain himself fades. The urge to justify his choices dissolves. The desire to be seen or validated disappears. Instead, he moves with a calm that comes from knowing himself so deeply that outside interpretation loses all power. People may misjudge him, misunderstand him, or project onto him, but none of it touches him anymore. This is the final shift, the point where he stops living in reaction to the world and starts living entirely from within. In this state, he becomes untouchable, not cold, but sovereign. He no longer wastes energy clarifying his intentions or proving his worth. He no longer translates his quietness into comfort for others. He no longer bends his identity to fit expectations he never agreed to. The misunderstanding of others becomes background noise, irrelevant to his mission. And ironically, the moment he stops needing to be understood is the moment people begin noticing the depth they once overlooked. This reality seems contrary to his standards and the ideal he once claimed as his truth. His silence becomes strength. His focus becomes magnetic. His independence becomes a force that shapes his path with absolute clarity. This is where he rises, not above others, but above the need for their approval. Before you leave, I want to ask you one thing. Have you ever reached a point where being understood no longer mattered? If you're one of the few who made it to this final line, comment "beyond need" to show it. And if you want more ultra-wise, deep psychology storytelling like this, subscribe now. The next breakthrough video is already in the making. He stops explaining himself because he finally recognizes that understanding is optional, not required. There comes a moment in a Sigma's evolution when he looks at the countless explanations he has given throughout his life, all the clarifications, all the emotional translations, all the attempts to help others see what he sees, and he realizes none of it ever truly mattered. Understanding is optional. His path was never meant to be validated by the perception of others. When this realization hits, it doesn't come with anger or bitterness. It comes with a quiet sense of liberation. He stops explaining himself not because he has given up on connection, but because he finally understands that his identity does not depend on anyone else's comprehension. He no longer wastes energy justifying decisions that were already made with clarity. He no longer dilutes his depth to fit in shallow minds. He no longer bends his truth to accommodate people who only half listened in the first place. This shift creates an internal freedom he has never experienced before. When he no longer needs people to understand him, he becomes untouchable. Misinterpretations roll off him like rain on stone. Judgments lose their sting. He moves through the world without seeking approval, permission, or validation. His decisions become cleaner, his direction becomes sharper, and his silence becomes intentional, not defensive. When someone misunderstands him now, he doesn't rush to correct them. He simply lets them keep their version. He knows their misunderstanding is a reflection of their lens, not a reflection of his truth. The need to be seen accurately fades because he has finally learned to see himself fully. The irony is that the less he explains, the clearer his presence becomes. People begin noticing the depth they once overlooked. His quiet confidence, his unshakable direction, his refusal to justify choices that were made from a place of inner certainty. Some admire it, some fear it, some misunderstand it even more, but none of it affects him anymore. He no longer feels compelled to educate others about who he is. He lets his actions speak, and his path unfold without commentary. He understands that those who are meant to understand him will do so naturally, without convincing, without performance, without explanation. By stepping out of the need to be understood, he steps into a deeper version of himself. He becomes grounded, self-trusting, and emotionally sovereign. He no longer reacts to misinterpretation because he no longer relies on being interpreted accurately. And this final shift transforms him from someone who once lived between worlds into someone who lives entirely from his own truth. He no longer needs validation, freeing him from emotional dependence on others' opinions. There comes a turning point in a Sigma's inner evolution when the weight of others' opinions finally slides off his shoulders. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens after years of seeing how fragile, inconsistent, and often uninformed those opinions truly are. He starts to notice that people praise him one moment and question him the next, that their admiration shifts with their mood, and that their criticism often says more about their fears than about his choices. And slowly he realizes something powerful. Validation is unstable currency. It inflates, it deflates, it disappears without warning. Depending on it is emotional bondage. So he frees himself. He stops seeking approval from people who don't live his life, don't understand his vision, and don't carry the consequences of his decisions. With that understanding, the need for validation dissolves, and so does the power others once held over him. Without the hunger for external approval, his identity becomes anchored within himself. He no longer waits for someone else to confirm that he is right, capable, talented, or strong. He doesn't look for applause to feel worthy, and he doesn't shrink when he doesn't receive it. His sense of value becomes self-generated, not audience-dependent. The silence of others no longer feels threatening. It feels peaceful. Their criticism no longer feels personal. It feels irrelevant. The noise of the world fades, and for the first time he hears only his own voice, calm, steady, and unshaken. This internal independence becomes his new foundation. It sharpens his focus, fortifies his confidence, and allows him to move with a clarity that external validation could never give him. As the need for validation disappears, so does emotional dependency. People can no longer influence him with their approval or disapproval. He no longer changes his direction to avoid judgment or earn praise. He no longer shapes his personality to be liked, understood, or celebrated. He lives authentically, even if it means being misunderstood, underestimated, or ignored. And ironically, this authenticity makes him more magnetic. People respect a man who does not bend for approval. They trust a man who stands firm in who he is, regardless of who is watching. By freeing himself from validation, he frees himself from emotional chains he never realized he was carrying. He becomes the source of his own worth, the architect of his own identity, and the judge of his own path. And once a Sigma reaches this level of inner independence, no opinion, positive or negative, has the power to shape him again. He embraces solitude as a source of clarity rather than a place of isolation. There is a profound shift that happens inside a Sigma male when he stops seeing solitude as a punishment and begins seeing it as a sanctuary. In the early stages of his life, he may have felt misunderstood, disconnected, or out of place among groups that valued conformity over authenticity. But as he matures, he realizes something transformative. Solitude is not emptiness. It is clarity. The silence he once tried to escape becomes the very space where he understands himself most deeply. He embraces solitude not because he is running from people, but because he is returning to himself. The world's noise, expectations, and emotional demands fade, and in the quiet, his thoughts sharpen, his intuition strengthens, his vision becomes unmistakable. What others call isolation, he now recognizes as refinement. In solitude, his inner world expands. He begins to see patterns in his life that were invisible when he was constantly surrounded by distractions. He understands which relationships nourish him and which drain him. He recognizes the goals that are truly his, not the ones he inherited from the expectations of others. Every hour spent alone becomes a conversation with his deeper self, the version of him that knows what he wants, what he fears, what he must release, and what he is meant to build. This clarity doesn't make him colder, it makes him more intentional. He no longer fills his time with people or tasks that dilute his purpose. Instead, he chooses with precision, and every choice strengthens the man he is becoming. What makes this shift so powerful is that solitude no longer feels like a withdrawal from the world. It feels like stepping into a higher state of awareness. While others fear being alone because it exposes their unresolved selves, the Sigma embraces it because it reveals his truth. He becomes more grounded, more observant, more centered. People start noticing the difference. His decisions become sharper. His boundaries become firmer. His presence becomes calmer, yet more commanding. Without saying a word, he radiates the strength of a man who knows himself deeply. By embracing solitude as clarity, he gains a level of self-direction that no crowd can provide. He no longer waits for consensus. He no longer fears misunderstanding. He no longer fills space just to avoid silence. He understands that solitude is not the absence of connection, it is the presence of self. And once a Sigma reaches this understanding, he becomes a man who walks alone not because he must, but because it's where he evolves the most. He releases the urge to correct misconceptions, knowing truth doesn't need defense. One of the final stages in a Sigma's evolution is the moment he stops feeling compelled to correct people's misunderstandings about him. For most of his life, he may have tried to clarify his intentions, explain his silence, or justify his choices. Not for validation, but to avoid being misread. But eventually he reaches a deeper truth. People will believe whatever fits their level of awareness, not his reality. Misconceptions are reflections of their perception, not of his character. And with this realization, he releases the urge to fix anyone's narrative. He understands that truth does not need defending. It stands unshaken, unaffected by distortion, and revealed in time. So he lets people think what they think, say what they say, assume what they assume. Their misunderstanding becomes irrelevant to his inner world. This shift gives him a level of peace that arguments could never achieve. When he no longer tries to correct misconceptions, he saves himself from countless emotional traps. The need to convince, the desire to be seen clearly, the disappointment when others misunderstand him despite his efforts. Instead of explaining himself to those who never truly listened, he retreats into calm certainty. He chooses silence over debate, clarity over reassurance, and direction over distraction. His energy is no longer spent defending who he is. It is invested in becoming who he is meant to be. And ironically, his refusal to engage with misconceptions often reveals how shallow or biased those misconceptions were in the first place. As he steps back from correcting others, something interesting happens. People begin to reveal themselves. Those with open minds seek deeper understanding, asking instead of assuming. Those with fixed or fragile egos cling harder to their false narratives, and those who never valued him simply drift away. His silence becomes a filter that separates genuine perception from projection, and he sees clearly who truly knows him and who only knows the version of him they invented. He doesn't interfere with this process, he welcomes it. Misconceptions now serve as clarity rather than conflict. By letting truth stand without defense, he becomes untouchable. False narratives lose the power to disturb him. Rumors lose the power to shape him. Assumptions lose the power to define him. He knows who he is, he knows his intentions, and he knows his path. And that is enough. Once a Sigma reaches this point, he walks through the world unaffected by distortion. Because a man who no longer needs to correct misconceptions is a man who has mastered himself. He becomes immune to judgment because he's grounded in his own inner compass. There comes a moment in a Sigma's evolution when judgment no longer penetrates him, not because people have stopped judging, but because he has stopped giving their judgment a place to land. He becomes anchored in something far deeper than external approval, his own inner compass. This inner compass is not built from trends, opinions, or societal expectations. It is built from self-awareness, lived experience, and an unshakable connection to his own value. When this compass becomes his guide, judgment from others becomes background noise, noticeable but powerless. People may criticize, misunderstand, or underestimate him, yet none of it moves him off his path. He is no longer emotionally swayed by the shifting winds of other people's perceptions. His direction comes from within, not from applause or disapproval. This immunity to judgment doesn't appear suddenly. It forms gradually, layer by layer. He realizes that most judgment comes from projection, fears, insecurities, and limitations others place on themselves. Very little of it has to do with him at all. He notices how quickly people change their opinions, how easily they criticize what they don't understand, and how often their judgment reflects their own inner battles. With this clarity, he stops internalizing their voices. He no longer feels the need to shrink to avoid criticism or expand to earn admiration. He moves at his pace, on his terms, guided by a vision no one else needs to comprehend. Judgment that once stung now dissolves before it reaches his core because he no longer looks outward for direction. What emerges from this emotional independence is a deeper, calmer strength. He becomes a man who listens to himself first, a man who trusts his instincts even when others disagree, a man who makes choices based on alignment, not acceptance. People sense this shift immediately. His confidence becomes quieter but more solid. His presence becomes more intentional. His decisions become more decisive. He is no longer reactive. He is rooted in judgment. Whether whispered behind his back or spoken to his face, fails to shake him because the foundation beneath him is finally unbreakable. This internal grounding transforms how he walks through the world. He stops defending his path, stops explaining his dreams, stops seeking permission to evolve. He simply follows his compass and lets others think what they want. And those who judge him most harshly often reveal their own insecurities in the process. But he doesn't correct them. He doesn't argue with them. He doesn't carry their opinions. He lets them stay where they belong, outside of him. Because once a Sigma becomes grounded in his inner compass, judgment is no longer a threat. It is just noise he has learned to walk through in complete peace. He chooses authenticity over approval, even if it means being misunderstood. Just to give us a heads up on this, a Sigma reaches a defining moment in his evolution when he realizes that every time he softened his truth to make others comfortable, he lost a piece of himself. Every time he chose approval over authenticity, he drifted further from his own identity. And so he decides, quietly, firmly, to stop performing and start living from his core. He chooses authenticity, not because it is easy, but because it is the only path that keeps him whole. This choice doesn't come without cost. Authentic men are rarely understood immediately. Their silence is misread. Their independence is questioned. Their depth is misinterpreted. But the Sigma accepts this. He knows that being misunderstood is a small price to pay for being real. Approval is temporary. Authenticity is eternal. When he embraces this truth, something inside him shifts. He no longer tailors his personality to fit expectations that were never his to meet. He no longer adjusts his values to avoid conflict or judgment. He no longer contorts himself into shapes that please the crowd but suffocate his spirit. Instead, he shows up as he is, unedited, unmasked, unfiltered. And because of that, he attracts clarity. The wrong people fall away quickly. They cannot bond with someone who refuses to play by the rules of social performance. But the right people begin to appear. Those who resonate with truth, depth, and consistency. In choosing authenticity, the Sigma doesn't lose connection. He simply loses the connections that were never real to begin with. Being misunderstood no longer rattles him. In fact, he welcomes it as confirmation that he is no longer shrinking to fit into places that cannot hold him. When someone misreads his silence, he lets them. When someone misinterprets his independence, he doesn't explain. When someone projects their insecurities onto him, he does not absorb them. He understands that people interpret him through the lens of their own limitations, not his reality. And so he moves freely through a world that often misunderstands depth, refusing to dim himself for the sake of shallow acceptance. His authenticity becomes his boundary, his filter, and his guide. This commitment to living truthfully fuels the final stage of his transformation. He becomes a man whose identity is self-known, whose purpose is self-defined, and whose path is self-led. Approval becomes irrelevant because he no longer needs the world to validate what he already knows. He is enough as he is. And once he chooses authenticity over approval, he becomes unshakable. A man impossible to manipulate, impossible to mold, and impossible to break. He rises above the need to be understood, becoming self-corrected, self-trusting, and unstoppable. There is a rare moment in a Sigma male's evolution when he stops caring whether the world understands him, not out of bitterness, but out of liberation. He rises above the need for others to get him because he finally realizes that most people don't even understand themselves. Their confusion is not his burden. Their expectations are not his map. Their interpretations are not his truth. And when he releases the need to be understood, something powerful unlocks inside him. He becomes self-corrected. His decisions grow sharper. His focus becomes laser-like. He no longer looks sideways for approval or reassurance. He moves forward, guided only by his internal compass, following a path that no one else needs to believe in for it to be real. This is the moment he stops living as a reaction to the world and begins living as a force within it. In this state, he becomes self-trusting in a way he never was before. He no longer doubts his intuition because others question it. He no longer delays his growth because others fear change. He no longer explains his silence, his direction, or his ambition. Instead, he lets his actions reveal what words never could. His trust in himself becomes unshakable, not because he thinks he is always right, but because he finally accepts that his inner guidance is more accurate than any external noise. This trust becomes the engine that drives his evolution. It pushes him to take risks others avoid, to step into solitude without hesitation, to pursue purpose instead of applause. And the more he trusts himself, the stronger and more precise his choices become. Once he reaches this level of independence, he becomes unstoppable. Not in the loud, dramatic way people often imagine, but in a quiet, disciplined, relentless way that others can't predict or control. He stops waiting for consensus. He stops seeking permission. He stops apologizing for outgrowing people who refuse to grow with him. Misunderstanding no longer distracts him. It fuels him. Doubt from others no longer slows him. It sharpens him. He rises into a version of himself that is ruled not by fear or validation, but by clarity and conviction. And this is the point where he becomes untouchable. Not because he isolates himself, but because he transcends the need to be interpreted, approved, or accepted. By rising above the need to be understood, he steps fully into his power. He becomes a man who follows his path without hesitation, trusts his voice without compromise, and moves through life with a momentum that no misunderstanding can interrupt. This is the final shift, the moment he evolves from being shaped by the world to shaping the world around him. In the end, a Sigma's final evolution isn't marked by noise, conflict, or grand declarations. It happens quietly, in the moment he stops needing to be understood and starts living entirely from his own inner truth. He no longer bends himself to fit the world. He no longer explains himself to ease others' confusion. He no longer trades authenticity for approval. He becomes self-directed, self-trusting, and unstoppable. The world may still misunderstand him, but he is no longer living for the world. He is living for the man he was always meant to become. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Do you follow your own inner compass, even when others don't understand your path? If you reach the end, comment, "Sinner Master," so I know you're one of the few who stays until the final word. And if you want more Deep Sigma Ultra psychological storytelling in this exact style, subscribe to UltraWise. The next transformation is already unfolding.